As Karim mentioned, I'll be representing Group IB and actually presenting some of the research that our team has done. We actually wanted to, and always do, want to present some relative research for the market that we're speaking in. So we had wanted to present some APT research connected to Canada. Some of the guys were disappointed when we switched last minute, but we'll share the details with you, maybe offline over a beer. And I think, relative to the story as well of how I ended up in Moscow. But today what we'll do is talk a little bit about something related to the Canadian market, and that's our investigation into the carding form called Brian's Club. So the title of my presentation is Payment Theft to Monetization, and a Competitive Marketplace. So Brian's Club, for those of you who don't know, was and still is a fairly large carding form. Early in October of this year, and a little bit earlier for us, a threat actor named Mr. Green, who we'll talk about a little bit later, actually released about 27 million cards to various cybersecurity companies and famous Brian Krebs, as you see here, the carding form was named after, so that these cards could be, released to the community and then onwards to, organizations who could take care of that. Upon receiving this information, obviously for us, very interesting to investigate. We provided it to Canadian government and some of the financial institutions so that they could take care of some of the problems. So that's what we'll talk about today. In terms of the compromised data that we identified, here you can see actually on the screen what our internal system looks like and how we identify some of the payment card details that have been compromised. In total, there was 26 million, just over, I think 27 million credit cards that were on the shop. If you put that value of about $500 that different organizations do to each payment card compromise, the shop value was quite large. In terms of full card information was there, that's information about the credit card numbers, CVV information, perhaps name of the card holder. That was about 800,000. In terms of the full card information is about 21,000. And in terms of Canadian dumps, making it relevant for you guys, it was about 500,000 in total. So dumps would have the track data, so ability to actually reprint cards using the magnetic strip information that was siphoned off. Usually this is compromised through post malware or skimming devices or something that can collect that magnetic strip data. So we'll take a closer look at some of the sellers of the dumps in terms of different actors that were selling them. So one actor, Test 7000, is responsible for about 12% of the different dumps. Krebs being one of the earliest actors on this carding form, about 10%, and others, very minority in terms of the contribution to that carding form. In terms of Canadian dumps, obviously Krebs is much more interested and has a higher percentage of those Canadian dumps at about 32%, Takar with 15%, and Ronaldo at 13%. If we start to look at the sellers of cards, now it starts to become more interesting. So Avia Card 777 was responsible for about 74% of the cards being sold on Brian's Club, and S Silver responsible for about 17%. And we'll take a look more about these actors later on. When we break this down into the sellers of Canadian cards, you can see that S Silver responsible for 38%, and Avia Card 777 responsible for about 56%. And we started to profile these actors as we go along in the presentation. So if you don't know how a card shop actually works, obviously there's the shop where all of the carding information can be available for sale. There's the buyers who would like to buy credit card information and use it for malicious purposes. The owner of the shop obviously collecting commissions from some of the sales going on. And then there's individual sellers that will compromise a few thousand credit cards, and then there'll be resellers that actually collect this information from individual or minor sellers and actually resell that on to the shop. And Avia Card and SS Silver were two of the main resellers on Brian's Club. The Avia Card was responsible for about 600,000 cards in total, 35,000 of those related to dumps, 11,000 of them related to Canadian cards, and 69 related to Canadian dump information. SS Silver, again, a large reseller on the Brian's Club market, 137 cards in total. There was 22,000 dumps in total for him, about 8%, give or take, of Canadian cards represented of that figure, and 265 Canadian dumps for that. So we started to look a little bit more into the different profiles that would be relative to the Canadian market. So AviaCard has been a seller of dumps and cards on multiple different underground forums since at least 2015. And as we mentioned on previous slides, he was responsible for about 600,000 cards in total, with 11,000 of those represented to Canadian cards. In terms of SS Silver, he was a reseller as well since about 2015 early. We know that he's a Russian-speaking actor from some of the underground forums that he posts on. We did identify some use of online gambling sites to actually siphon off money into these sites and launder it through them. He was responsible for about 137,000 payment card details, with 8,000 of those relative to Canadian institutions. So we started to look and hunt for different online monikers that connected back to SS Silver. Here you can see different monikers that connect back to SS Silver, so Ivan Ivanovich, which is like John Smith in English. Different email addresses and Telegram connected back to that, which introduced 2 other actors. We did manage to connect the Telegram account back to another actor called, another moniker, called R Gold. Which led us to different emails. You can see one of them is actually called Uber Service. So from this Uber Service email, we were able to identify different posts on underground forums connected to this email about how he's actually starting to monetize some of those stolen credit card information, maybe that he doesn't sell. So he has one service that he actually offers through Uber. So here you can see a post in Russian. He's actually offering free rides or for a very small cost on Uber in Moscow. SPB would be St. Petersburg, EKB would be Ekaterinburg in Russia, but also offers this type of service in the US market, EU and UK. So this is one of his fronts for actually monetizing some of the credit card information that he collects. So now let's take a look at some of the sellers of dump information. So you can see all of them listed here, and we'll go through them kind of step by step. Krebs, Takar, Ronaldo, Pierre, and we profiled some of the ones that we actually were able to garner some of the information from. So Krebs, he was one of the first registered on Brian's Club shop. So when we went into actually the shop and started to look at some of the information that was hosted there, he had one of the earliest numbers for usernames within that carding shop. So we know that either he's one of the accounts for the shop owners or the shop owner itself. He also had access to API access, so we wouldn't actually have to visit the shop. He could just automatically put the information onto the shop in an automated fashion. Pierre, he was specifically interested in Canadian dumps, so if you want to conduct some further investigations on this, I'll supply our report and presentation afterwards. So he was responsible for about 86,000 dumps on the carding shop, and 44,000 of those relative to Canadian institutions. He was also particularly interesting because we found a couple of posts on Undergrounds where he was looking for RDP access to different post malware, post systems like Microsystem, for example, from Oracle. So he could be, an actor who's looking for access to different post systems within Canada, and then shipping that information off to different carding forms that he exfiltrates. Best Fresh, another actor that was selling dump information, English-speaking actor. He had been actually removed from a number of different carding shops without any explanation, but also a high percentage of information connected back to Canadian dump information. Test 7000 was one of the largest providers of dumps, but a lesser percentage as focused on to Canada. We did do some further research onto phishing kits and looking for his email accounts and monikers connected to that, and did detect that he was conducting some phishing attacks into PayPal within 2014. Then we did some further analysis on the cards. We wanted to try to find out, is this information coming from one different source or another? One of the things that we actually learned in the last couple of years to identify different maybe issues that are happening within the financial sector is to actually monitor the information that's being posted on underground forums. So, for example, connected an incident to Lazarus in Pakistan actually this year. It's public knowledge. You can Google it. And we were researching underground forums, and quite frankly, it's like 000 every month, and then all of a sudden, 200,000 cards posted in one go. And oftentimes that's an indicator, to do further research for the financial sector and potentially understand if there's some payment gateway or maybe large post-malware infection, etc. So we actually did some research into the cards. We do a lot of research into different JavaScript sniffers. These are essentially JSs that would be installed in different e-commerce websites to steal payment card details. And our analysts will identify the gates of these different JavaScript sniffers, and as a result, identify the payment card details that have been compromised. And we actually identified that there was quite a large crossover between Avia Card 777 and S Silver, two different JavaScript sniffer families through our analysis. So Avia Card, as you remember, was one of those that focused on Canadian dumps, had about 111 cards that were the same. So it could be, that they were compromised twice, not necessarily that definitive. And then they were the same as a JavaScript criminal actor, the criminal actor that manages the JavaScript that we call Coffee Moco. But SS Silver, on the other hand, had about 2,069, which were the exact same and also compromised by Coffee Moco. So then we started to look into when were they compromised first. And maybe just to give you a little bit more background for those of you who might not know, just information about JavaScript sniffers. So if you've read the media, they are happening more and more. British Airways was one of the first websites to be compromised by JS sniffers, and thousands upon thousands of credit card information from those customers were then compromised. So this has become a particular area of interest for Group IB to research and to identify data that can be exfiltrated by compromising different e-commerce websites. So you can see with this type of malicious code installed in an e-commerce website, they could get information about the bank card numbers, names, address, login and passwords, or any other information that they'd like to exfiltrate from that specific user session. In terms of how the cybercriminal actually manages the JavaScript sniffer, it's typically hard to track these, and they can use multiple different gates, but they will infect an e-commerce website. They will do so by exploiting different content management system software that haven't been patched, for example, upload their JavaScript and start to send or siphon off payment card details to their JavaScript sniffer gates, and then onward to their administrative panels where the cybercriminal can then actually collect the money. So then we started to look at, okay, we have cards that were both compromised on Brian's Club Shop and also cards that were compromised by the JavaScript sniffer criminal group that we call Coffee Moco. So we looked at the two groups that were relative to Canadian institutions, Avia Card 777. For the most part, all of the cards were compromised first on Brian's Club, but 39% of the cards that we analyzed were first on Coffee Moco. But when we looked at actually SS Silver's cards, actually 88% of all of the cards that were that were compromised through both of these sources and both on Brian's Club as well, were actually compromised by Coffee Moco first, which kind of led us to believe that SS Silver was perhaps using Brian's Club as a way to monetize some of his JS sniffer operations, which was an interesting finding for us. Here's actually a screenshot of what some of the obfuscated code for Coffee Moco's JS sniffer on the top left-hand corner and the deobfuscated code on the bottom left-hand corner. And actually that would be some of the file paths and places once you actually identify the gate for that JS sniffer where the cybercriminal will store the information from some of the payment card details that he has actually compromised. In terms of this being, a threat for, Canadian institutions and consumers, not only Canadian, we see it becoming, a bigger threat more and more. Coffee Moco Group in particular, they've infected at least 526 online stores that we know about. It could be much more since January of 2019. And they've compromised more than 340,000 payment card details or cards from their operations. And they actually we found out through the analysis, launched their own card shop at the beginning of 2019 as well, and were perhaps using Brian's Club, as it was much more popular than the card shop that they just launched, to actually monetize the cards until their carding shop became more popular, and then they would start to siphon off their information to that. In terms of some of the incidents that Coffee Moco was actually responsible for, there's many of them, but one of the most famous is the Sotheby's Home online store, which they compromised in December of 2017, and were actually siphoning off payment card details from Sotheby's. So this is actually the shop that Coffee Moco launched. So this is an interesting finding for us through this analysis when they launched it in 2019. It wasn't as popular. That's why we believe that there was a crossover from Brian's Club to some of the JavaScript sniffer compromises earlier on. But we believe that they actually launched this carding shop to monetize the information with less commission than they were doing before, for example. So how did this actually all happen in the first place? How did this information become, publicly or semi-publicly available? So a gentleman named Mr. Green, actually, as he called himself, had a little bit of trouble on the battlefield. He's presumably the individual responsible for this leak, and we started to gather more information about that through public source. So Krebs was contacted by this individual, and numerous posts on underground forums by cybercriminals, where they posted his information online. You can see his Jabber IDs, email addresses, etc., and started to provide more information about him actually being a ripper. So he actually got shunned from the community. All the cybercriminals pretty much knew that he was the one that provided the details to not only Group IB and Brian Krebs, but there was also Digital Shadows, I believe, who received some of this information. And in the bottom right-hand corner, it might be difficult to see for you, but here's the post where they actually provide all of his information that was available online, so other cyber criminals can start to conduct investigation, and of course, law enforcement could also start to conduct investigations from this information. The motivation for him certainly was that he was opening up his own carding form. So here you can see some of the posts in October, almost exactly when this information became available, when he's starting to announce that he's launching a carding form. So definitely trouble on the battlefield for him. So if you'd like to learn more information about some of the investigations that we conducted, certainly I can answer questions that you have here, or we can provide the full report to all of the countermeasures attendees today, and I'd be happy to do that. You can just email me and provide you any more information that you'd like. Thank you.